Hello and welcome to the final conference of the project CRISEA. The acronym CRISEA stands for Competing Regional Integrations in Southeast Asia. And the project is devoted to the interdisciplinary study of regional integration here. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, it brings together 13 institutions based in Europe and Southeast Asia. This conference showcases the project's main results. We had hoped to host it in person in Paris, but the coronavirus crisis has made that impossible. So we opted instead for this online format. We were fortunate that most of our fieldwork was completed before the pandemic hit, and that we held our last research workshop in Chiang Mai exactly a year ago in February 2020, just before international travel was interrupted. Today's program consists of 6 short panels. In the first, we summarize the research findings, a word on the project's challenges from Yves Goudineau, CRISEA's first coordinator, is followed by a synthesis of its results by Jacques Leider, the scientific coordinator. And I take this opportunity to say a warm thank you to Yves, who led the project in its first 2 years, and to Jacques, who has cheerfully and tirelessly coordinated our research and dissemination activities since the start. It was Jacques who, among many other things, selected the 5 case studies presented in panel 2. And panel 3 then offers an insight into CRISEA's production of web documentaries, introduced here by Silvia Vignato, who I thank for coordinating this. The final panels are devoted to comments. In panel 4, we hear from Michael Montesano, a member of our academic advisory board, and Terence Gomez, one of the work package leaders. While in panel 5, the screen goes very briefly to 6 other work package leaders for some concluding remarks. The conference closes with a keynote speech given by Professor Amitav Acharya, who is joining us very early in the morning from American University in Washington, DC. Before I give the screen to Yves Goudineau of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, I would like to say a word of thank you too to Elizabeth Lacroix, CRISEA's project manager, for her indispensable contribution to the project's smooth running. And a quick reminder for all the presenters, when you've finished, please pass the screen to the next speaker in your panel. And please too, do keep to time as our schedule is tight. Yves Goudineau will now speak on the project's challenge. So Yves, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for your words of introduction. As the first of the whole coordinator of CRISEA, I'm highly satisfied and even moved, I must say, to see the project reach this final conference, having achieved most of its objectives, and I would say even more. And this in spite of the obstacles we had to overcome, not least COVID-19, which we decided to take as an additional research object. When CRISEA was launched in 2017, with a consortium led by the FAO, of which I was then director, we knew that we would face many challenges given the project's ambitions and its limited duration of 3 years. We built on our experience of a previous European project, CTIDE, which also focused on the issue of integration in Southeast Asia. CTIDE gave priority to field studies, including historical and anthropological perspectives, to document the local impacts of integration and see who benefited and who was excluded. The originality of CRISEA was a combination of this case study approach with economic and political analysis at the scale of the global ASEAN framework. This combined use of macro and micro level data is one of the characteristics of the project, implying a multidisciplinary methodology, both quantitative and qualitative. The micro-macro challenge was to get economists, political scientists, development experts to work with sociologists, anthropologists, historians, or geographers and produce common results. Jacques Leider will tell us later that how these cross collaborations have led to original findings, the publication of which will make a notable contribution, I think, to academic knowledge of Southeast Asia. Another challenge was to make these results known outside of academic circles. CRISEA has fostered many fruitful dialogue with government and non-government actors, including policymakers, stakeholders, diplomats, NGO workers, and journalists through a series of dissemination workshops and briefing sessions held in Asia and in Europe. The project drew on its partner on local networks, including those of the EFAO's 9 branches in Southeast Asia, to organize meetings in Chiang Mai, Hanoi, Manila, Kuala Lumpur, Yangon, Mandalay, Jakarta, without forgetting several sessions at the European External Action Service in Brussels. One of our objectives was to build a sustainable network of European and Southeast Asian researchers. Strong partnerships formed during the CITAI project were significantly expanded and consolidated with CRISEA. It has been obviously a challenge to keep a consortium of 13 institutions with almost 80 researchers running harmoniously and productively. And of course, some adjustments were necessary at the start of the project. We can see today the quality of working relations and the cooperation with the coordination team have been decisive in the project's success, and everyone, I think, is to be thanked for it. Indeed, this project has provided the opportunity to establish scientific collaborations that I sincerely believe will be sustainable. But it has created friendships that cement lasting cooperation, and I consider that we can be proud of that. I must say that it has been an honor for the FAO to lead this consortium of prestigious institutions. I would like to thank Andrew Hardy for agreeing to take over from me as coordinator midway through the project. And I am happy to hand over Jacques Leider, scientific coordinator, to whom we are all indebted, and will now present a synthesis of the project and its finding. Thank you. Jacques.
Thank you, Yves. Dear colleagues, dear friends, CRISEA has been a huge collective effort of over 80 researchers. I have now the privilege to review the activities and the scientific outcome of this amazing interdisciplinary project. 20 minutes might not be enough to review the project's development since late 2017, but suffices to celebrate our successful engagements in scientific output, dissemination, and network building. CRISEA responded to an EU proposal, engaging together globally, and that is what we did, engaging together across 13 countries and 2 continents. Let me thank all of you who have contributed to this project, Andrew, Yves, and Elizabeth, with whom I enjoyed working in the management team, the director of the FAO, Christophe Maquet, for his support, the work package leaders, who became trusted friends on whom I could rely, and all the researchers who have invested time and energy, often not just one time, but many times. Thanks for your dedication and responsiveness. Thanks for the hospitality I have personally met in Hanoi, Manila, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Cambridge, Porchida, Oslo, Chiang Mai, and Mandalay. Coordinating the project for over 3 years was not just an instructive, but also an emotionally uplifting experience. Let me now turn to my PowerPoint to guide you through a review of the activities. Do you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we do.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
We started as a consortium of 13 institutions and met for the first time at our kickoff meeting in Chiang Mai in December 2017. Most of us were anxious, curious, and our minds still full of questions how to organize our work, the scientific coordinator included. We were also wondering what we would do with the macro-micro dialogue challenge and who would dialogue with whom in the end. A few months later, we met in Hanoi. We met in Hanoi in March 2018 for our first research workshop organized by the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences and the EFAO Center there. The event helped flesh out the composition of the thematic work packages and laid the groundwork for working paper number 1 on the state of the art of research in each theme. Our first dissemination workshop took place in Manila in February 2019 and was organized by Jayeel Cornelio and his team at the Ateneo de Manila on the subject of identity. In April 2018, Tomas Larsson organized the second research workshop in Cambridge for the work package studying the state. A month later, in May 2019, Pietro Massina and his team followed with a second research workshop at the University of Naples after the fourth conference of the Italian Association of Southeast Asian Studies, where many project members participated. The Cambridge and Naples workshops generated a set of progress reports on the project's field research with prospective conclusions. A second dissemination workshop took place in Kuala Lumpur in July 2019, organized by Terence at the University of Malaya, with his team and excellent collaboration with the EU delegation in Malaysia. CRISEA researchers contributed to an array of academic events. The 10th EuroCS conference in Berlin in September 2019 was a highlight as CRISEA researchers organized a roundtable and several panels. In December 2019, CRISEA's work package on the environment had its dissemination workshop in Chiang Mai, organized by Thomas Kaminski and Carl Middleton with the support of Chiang Mai University and the EFAO Center. The third research workshop was also held in Chiang Mai in February 2020. This was in the early phase still of the COVID pandemic, when most people did not yet feel threatened, but when our Portuguese and Vietnamese colleagues were already prevented from attending. We discussed our research findings and publication plans, viewed documentaries, and the work packages responded in multiple ways to the macro-micro challenge. Immediately afterwards, our colleagues at Mandalay University, with Dorothy Datouin and her team, organized the fourth dissemination workshop on the state, followed by an event held in Yangon with the help of the French Cultural Institute. The last dissemination workshop was run out of Jakarta on the subject of the region and organized as a couple of online sessions. Success, each research workshop and each dissemination workshop was productive, though each event had a different character, different shape, and different flavor. Now, let me also say a word about the policy briefings for EU diplomats. They were an integral part of our dissemination activities in Southeast Asia, and we also organized, as it has been said, policy briefings for the European External Action Service at their headquarters in Brussels, and more recently set up another 2 virtual sessions, the last one actually taking place tomorrow, 23rd February. The format which we have developed and fine-tuned over time in exchange with diplomats has met ongoing positive feedback. CRISEA research communicated critical and new insights in ways that add to existing knowledge, but do also challenge received views. Each policy briefing session, as well as our dissemination workshops, generated short pieces called policy briefs put at the hand of policymakers. When Tomas Larsson launched the COVID-19 sub-project last summer, it resulted in another set of policy-relevant briefs providing description and analysis of Southeast Asian national and regional experiences with the pandemic. Another deliverable of our project has been the working papers, which resulted from different meetings and were all posted on our website, CRISEA.eu. On the website, visitors do also find our e-newsletters, which highlight the profiles of each work package, include interviews, editorials, and an evolving list of latest CRISEA member publications. Finally, each work package produced a documentary, another deliverable of the project. These outputs are starting points for further reflection and discussion on the way we publish and disseminate research in the social sciences and humanities. Well, this brings my overview of CRISEA activities to an end, and then I would like to move on towards the second part of my presentation, which is the scientific report. Dear colleagues, the CRISEA project was organized in 5 arenas to consider different forces competing for integration and disintegration in Southeast Asia. The project's design of 2017 described several of these forces in the Trumpian world we were entering then. China opposed to the US, and the threatening players such as Japan and the EU, industrialization and resource hunger, threats to livelihood security, the illiberal state, post-conflict migrations, and doubts about ASEAN's capacity to respond to the challenges of its legitimacy. Work packages were set up and research modules organized to address these competing and potentially disruptive forces in 5 arenas: environment, economy, state, identity, and the region. As we take stock of the rich results of our research, we find ourselves using a more nuanced and better informed set of expressions. Counterintuitively, competition can bring people and nations into closer interaction, and competing forces, as we call them, may ultimately dissolve into efficient processes and lead to potentially better cooperation. What the CRISEA project reveals are certainly multiple forms of integration throughout the Southeast Asian region. And this against the background of this shift in perception that I review our work. Let me first bring to your attention the arena of the region and with it ASEAN. For over 5 decades, ASEAN has defended the national and collective interests of its member states. Joining ASEAN was an attractive option for Myanmar, and it remains an ongoing attractive option for East Timor, a candidate. But as ASEAN does not practice the type of integration which the EU does, CRISEA research redirects our attention to ASEAN cooperation and centrality. However, economic crisis, environmental hazards, the rise of China, and even conceptual change, such as the Indo-Pacific, have put pressure on ASEAN's centrality and raised the question how it would adjust its mode of operations. Broadly speaking, ASEAN centrality is a road of opportunities if ASEAN can take the lead and deploy agency. CRISEA's research demonstrates both the risks and the chances for ASEAN with new agreements. ASEAN is not only a facilitator of dialogue, but also an integral part of agreement making. It is also challenging for outsiders. Take China, which has to deploy an array of strategies, such as consultative governance, cultivation of elites, and support of frontier governance. In conclusion, facing challenges to regional cooperation and threats of disintegration, ASEAN's centrality is likely to gain if it leads and pursues its goals. Let me now move to the political economy and the issue of equitable growth studied by Work Package 2. CRISEA research on Vietnam made a review of the hybrid evolution of Southeast Asian economies and consequences of uneven development, such as the precarious lives of labor migrants. If FDI-driven industrialization has contributed to poverty reduction, it assures no sustainable path to prosperity because it perpetuates conditions of vulnerability. CRISEA explains the fundamental disconnection between industrial parks, where production takes place, and the reproduction of mostly female rural labor, which spends just a few years in the factories. National and transnational migratory flows of labor remain important. Research on China's engagement in Malaysia demonstrates the rise of its state-driven investment and development plans in the region. China's deployment of state-owned enterprises to pursue infrastructure projects and industrial investments has championed public-public partnerships at an elite political level and displaced the regional state's close nexus with multinational companies. But research findings also show a potentially beneficial picture of China's engagement with ties extended to privately owned enterprises. Uneven development and economic interdependence point to the primary responsibility of state governments. Informed actors are in demand, and the need of an informed state is exemplified in other CRISEA research on Malaysia. The overall conclusion is the primacy of the Southeast Asian state's role as an informed, decisive, and responsible actor to enable the path to equitable growth. This conclusion leads me to CRISEA research on the state. A strongly affirmative state raises questions of its legitimacy, such as those examined by Work Package 3. Southeast Asia's diverse political regimes mix liberal and illiberal practices in hybrid ways. Though they display sometimes surprisingly liberal streaks, CRISEA research points essentially into one direction, namely an authoritarian turn. The Thai monarchic system has taken advantage of time-honored rituals to counter modernist religious movements. Philippines President Duterte's populism marks a shocking break in the country's liberal tradition. But middle-class attitudes are not uniformly bent by populism. In fact, Southeast Asia's highly personalized populism brought together very diverse groups, also by creating internal enemies, such as drug addicts. With current events raising further attention for Myanmar, CRISEA research on political hybridity and the tutelary regime clarify the shaky domestic power balance. Besides spaces where liberal norms are receding, other research recognizes local context where negotiation between the authorities and civil organizations pays off, or consensual societal practices overcome predominant state ideology or leave some autonomous space. Elsewhere, more ambivalent relational modes might prevail. We learn that it is not like the Southeast Asian state is rational and the public irrational. Liberal activists may be bound by rationality, while state-supported arguments are rooted in traditional norms. Liberal principles may also be challenged by civil groups themselves, such as Islamist contestation of the Pancasila principles in Indonesia. Moreover, the nature of a political regime does not predict its reactions to state-critical protests. Now let me turn to lives and identities in the arena of the non-state world. CRISEA research reveals dynamics of getting together, acting together, and imagining commonality in the non-state world. One example is the integration of business relations and inter-ASEAN investments. Another shows Indonesian millennials testifying to their awareness of shared regional interests embedded in ASEAN's integration vision. Researchers working on identity, studied by Work Package 4, focused on the complications of alternative identity formations in modules highlighting transnationalism, generations, and violence. They looked at developments below the radar of states. Their research draws on grassroots perspectives and collective reimaginings. They contrast with CRISEA case studies where the state themselves are deeply involved. One striking example is the violent encounters of Vietnamese coastal fishers who, as they access fishing grounds in the South China Sea illegally, become simultaneously national actors representing national claims within the regional geopolitical game. Other studies highlight entanglements between global capitalism, international law, and migrant labor. Despite different scholarly orientations, all these studies confirm the fluidity of identities. But they underscore the relevance of material, legal, and political conditions in identity formations on top of more commonly invoked factors of culture and tradition. Within the arena of competing identities, history and memory inform many case studies, and the burden of the past is acknowledged in cross-disciplinary CRISEA research exploring individual and social memory, which shows how the recent past lives on in the present. Work on different generations of migrant workers in deindustrializing Indonesia was primarily interested in issues of human security, but the record of their lives in special economic zones provides also much historical depth. Other work focused on identity in association with violence and generational conflict demonstrates deep political and social rifts and lingering memories of suffering. Research on the nexus of identity and traumatic pasts invested in case studies of mass violence where the impact has been unpredictable. Finally, we come to the last of our 5 arenas, environment and natural resources, studied in Work Package 1. Environmental issues and issues of ecological governance are global and must be a central concern for Southeast Asian economies. CRISEA researchers raised questions about the transition into a low-carbon economy and how to secure the commons. The link between academic work and policy-relevant recommendations livens up in the concept of co-production of environmental knowledge created by stakeholders at multiple levels. It means that the way in which we know and represent the world cannot be separated from the way in which we want to live in it, and by implication, the way we want to govern our resources. What CRISEA research explores is the clash of modernizing visions of business conglomerates and states to exploit the resource of rivers and the sea on the one hand, and on the other, the interest of local communities. One conclusion is that water resource politics are not just about competing stakeholders, but more fundamentally about different values associated with the water. Can sharing knowledge generate a fruitful dialogue? The nexus is explicit in the study of global city networks, sharing their experiences about environmentally relevant urban policies. Nonetheless, Southeast Asian cities still see themselves on the receiver side, learning from the West, rather than sharing their own experiences. Now let me finish my review with a few conclusive observations. CRISEA set out to investigate the multiple and competing forces of integration sketched at the start of this review, such as China's hegemony, unrestrained neoliberal forces, threats to human security, and doubts about ASEAN's capacity. Its findings deliver a complex picture which confirms the economic, political, and social challenges hypothesized by CRISEA's framework, where integration depended on resolving conflicts. Much of our research at the micro level is densely packed with meanings encrusted in the project's title, competition, and often enforced integration. But the research also contains a second set of meanings that run counter to that narrative. Indeed, some of the findings articulate a critique of the project's original assumptions. There are multiple forces of integration at work in the region, but not all of them compete. In many contexts, cooperation results from competition. Our research shows that Chinese multi-level strategy and economic interdependence are not just predatory, but also offer opportunities. Shared concerns will pull countries together at the elite political level. Resource nationalism does not preclude cooperation. CRISEA researchers take a mixed but overall positive review of recent trade agreements. In conclusion, the project results make a strong case for enhanced integration in the long term. This integration will be driven by multiple forces that cooperate as much as they compete. Finally, with social media and global insecurity, there are forces at the grassroots level that bring the younger generation in the region together. The young would rather side with the liberal than the authoritarian state. As we look on to political protests led by young people both in Thailand and Myanmar who talk to each other, we realize that the competing forces for the political direction of a country may not just play out within a single national arena, but across borders and be therefore of fundamental significance for the orientation of the region as a whole. In this context, the CRISEA project generates an outbound message to the European Commission to pursue its support for research in the humanities and the social sciences whose protagonists can deliver policy-relevant knowledge on Southeast Asia, strengthen and extend collaborative networks, and sustain forward-looking multidisciplinary dialogues. Thank you very much. I would like to hand over to Carl for the first case study.
Thank you very much, Jacques. I will share my screen. I think you will need to stop sharing your screen, and I will put my screen on. Great, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jacques, for handing over, and it's been a great pleasure to be a part of this CRISEA project. I have the opportunity to share very briefly on the research that I've been involved in within our team on Work Package 1, exploring transnational water issues on the Mekong and the relationship between upstream and downstream. So as Jacques flags or outlines that there are partial cooperations and competition in the region, we most definitely see that in the case of the Mekong. So we're talking about both partial cooperation and competition between state actors, as well as with private actors and civil society actors too. So for example, around navigation across borders on the Mekong, or in the case of hydropower dam construction and operation, which will be the focus of this presentation today. Related to that is also cooperation around sharing water and related resources across borders, so in the context of floods and droughts and low flow. A second context that is important to the research that we undertook relates to the evolving governance regime in Southeast Asia, and in particular the role of a long-standing institution called the Mekong River Commission, a relatively newer intergovernmental organization called the Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation, but then also other institutions such as the Mekong-US Partnership and civil society-led networks such as the Mekong People's Council. So the particular research that we undertook had an empirical focus on northern Thailand. And in this present, it asked questions of what are the contested institutions and their imaginaries for transboundary water governance on the river, and then how the politics of knowledge influence transboundary water governance relating to the co-production of knowledge that Jacques also mentioned. In this presentation, I will just very briefly outline the approach of the research and the key findings. So first, giving a brief analysis of the mandate, role, and knowledge production of the two interstate organizations, the LMC and the MRC, then their relationship, then discussing a little bit on water data politics in relation to drought, and then a community-led initiative before drawing some brief conclusions. So first, for those that are unfamiliar with the region, the most long-standing intergovernmental cooperation is the Mekong River Commission, whose mandate is to cooperate in all fields of sustainable development, utilization, management, and conservation of water and related resources in the basin. So MRC has increasingly been mandated at the highest level with 3 summits, leadership level summits in 2010, 2014, and 2018, signifying the highest level commitment to the organization. The MRC is a knowledge-focused organization that has also increasingly taken on the role of water diplomacy. So it undertakes activities such as analysis and modeling and assessment, forecast and warning, data acquisition and sharing, and producing basin development plans. So in terms of the question that we ask of the production of knowledge, really overall the MRC produces knowledge that aligns with an ecological modernization approach to development, which we can see, for example, in its commitment to sustainable development and the use of integrated water resources management as a framework. One interesting shift that's happened during the duration of this research has been the announcement of the MRC with its new strategic plan and basin development plan that has signified its shift from just cooperating on knowledge acquisition and sharing and towards comprehensive cooperation on water resources development and management across the entire Mekong Basin. The second key institution that was only launched in 2016 is the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation. Now, the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation is, at the broadest level, a regional cooperation around economic cooperation that is between the 5 countries of mainland Southeast Asia and China. But it also includes an important component on transboundary water cooperation, and that has been progressively institutionalized, in particular in the form of the Lanchang Mekong Water Resources Cooperation Center. Similar to the MRC, the LMC has been progressively mandated through a series of leadership level summits. So again, this is a very significant institution in the region. The LMC also broadly holds an ecological modernization agenda, as we can see by the way that it plans for a green Mekong region. It also, similar to the MRC, produces scientific transboundary water knowledge. But in the case of the LMC, this is accompanied by significant amounts of project finance. China also, as the leader of the LMC, holds significant material control over the Mekong, given that there's been progressively a series of dams built in the upper Mekong that enables China to control the headwaters. We can also see that the LMC is a China-led counterbalance to other regional initiatives in the region. The MRC and the LMC have progressively sought to demonstrate a measure of cooperation whilst also competing at the same time. So for example, before the LMC, China had tried to demonstrate cooperation through a dialogue relationship that included sharing of wet season data. But as I'll discuss briefly in more detail shortly, since October 2020, China has started sharing dry season data with downstream countries. There's also been other forms of cooperation, such as meetings, staff exchanges, and field visits, as well as dialogue meetings and joint research. To an extent, this degree of cooperation should suggest that the state-led organizations between the MRC and the LMC at their core are compatible because they basically share a similar ecological modernization approach to water management. They have a shared ontology, in other words. But at the same time, there is a very fundamental underlying tension between the LMC and the MRC over the mandate to govern the transboundary water, including the mandate to plan. So turning briefly to a flashpoint that has occurred over the past couple of years, but when we can trace back to the construction of dams since the early 1990s in the upper basin. So over the last 3 years, including right now, there have been very low flows in the Mekong River. And accompanying that has been changes in the river water quality. So the river has changed to a blue hue, sediment has settled out, algae has been growing, which has affected fishery-based livelihoods in the lower countries. And central to this debate has been what role has infrastructure played in the basin, in particular upstream infrastructure constructed on the upper Mekong in China. And there's maybe two sides to this discussion. One is, could the projects have been operated differently to mitigate the impact? The other is whether the projects were actually causing the low flows in the lower Mekong. So on the one hand, China has claimed that the upstream dam cascade is increasing the regulative capacity of the river that can help mitigate extreme droughts and floods, whereas downstream civil society and sometimes the downstream governments have been more critical of China's motives and argued that actually the way that the river has been modified is not that different from previous years when there haven't been a drought. So there's much that could be said about this. I'm only covering it briefly in this presentation. One of the key issues has been the lack of data in the way that upstream projects have been operated, because China had only shared rainy season data about how projects are storing water. Even the MRC has pushed progressively for more data sharing from China upstream. And obviously, sharing data would be one way to address the often heated debates about whether upstream projects are responsible for the drought or not. Sorry, responsible for low flows. A key transformative moment that happened in 2019, or actually in 2020, was the release of a study that was funded by the US, produced by a consultancy called Eyes on Earth, that used satellite data to look at the water levels in the upstream, and essentially put forward a very strong analysis that upstream projects were affecting downstream flows. And this was picked up in the media and civil society, that led to a very heated global debate, public debate, about the role of China in responsible for the low flow and the drought. But at the same time, this also raised important questions about the quality of the analysis and the use of scientific data, and led to other studies, including from reputable researchers like Tsinghua University, that argued that actually the projects were not responsible, but rather it was the regional drought. But this had significant implications for regional cooperation. It led to a heated exchange of words between the US and China. But ultimately, it also led to the announcement that China would start sharing dry season data. Although very importantly, this dry season data only comes from 2 points on the river at the lowest point, and is disconnected from an institutionalization of transboundary water governance. I just want to very briefly cover other ways of thinking about knowledge production and water water governance and data production, which is a local community initiative in northern Thailand. So this is the Ng People's Council, and it's a civil society-led approach working with communities along a tributary of the Mekong. So they have progressively networked together to produce a very different vision, which is how they would term it is living with the river, that emphasizes local community participation in conserving natural resources. In December 2020, they organized a network meeting that tried to expand the network across Thailand, and also to talk about a Mekong peoples network. So in terms of knowledge production, it emphasizes community-led knowledge, which is an increasingly, a well-recognized approach in Thailand and increasingly regionally. So Thai-ban research or community research that really documents by communities themselves their knowledge of the river. And this interview with local civil society leaders emphasizes that local people see the river differently to the way that scientific and engineering data is produced by the MRC and LMC. There have also been responses by the Ng People's Council to the drought, including both recognizing the value of local resources, like this ceremony, the prolonged forest and river ceremony, and also releasing analysis that challenges the way that the drought has been analyzed by the MRC and the LMC, and also the regional governments. So in conclusion, this research has worked at both a scholarly level and also in a policy sense as well. So in terms of research conclusions, the research is suggesting that the creation of future Mekong imaginaries through the co-production of ecological knowledge and water governance bounds the possibilities of the present by imagining the future. The MRC and the LMC emphasize ecological modernization, whilst the community-led initiatives emphasize both the river as a local resource that supports local livelihoods and local economies, but also has cultural values. In terms of policy implications, I think knowledge politics is very central to transboundary water governance in the region, including the fact that more water data is being shared. But then at the same time, water data sharing has been disconnected from the actual institutionalization of accountability. So whilst water data sharing is a good first step, there now needs to be more discussion about the institutionalization of accountability across borders for transboundary water governance. So this is a very brief summary of the research that we've done on transboundary water. Thank you very much for listening. And I'd now like to hand over to Dennis Arnold of the University of Amsterdam, who will talk on work package 2 on the economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carl, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the chance to present some of my research. let's see. Okay, is that looking good? You all can see. Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about the impact of COVID-19 on special economic zones in, well, Southeast Asia, more specifically Cambodia. That's been the main focus of my research. With this specific project, I'd also been doing a parallel project where I did some similar studies in Myanmar, but in these 10 minutes, I'll focus on Cambodia. And to talk about special economic zones in the case of Cambodia is essentially to talk about the garment industry. And so in this presentation, I'll sum up some of the key impacts on Cambodia's garment industry as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are four interrelated areas to that I would like to draw out. First, specifically the COVID impacts. Secondly is the ongoing authoritarian turn in Cambodia, which has led to the European Union partially suspending or withdrawing its everything but arms trade arrangement with Cambodia. So that happened this past August. I'll briefly touch upon that. And then I'll situate these changes or these issues in Cambodia in the wider changing political economy of the global apparel industry. And lastly, draw out a few points on where Cambodia is positioned in this changing global apparel industry and the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic and the EBA suspension has accelerated some of these changes and the implications for, well, primarily workers in Cambodia. This is the main area of concern with my research. So in terms of the COVID-19 impacts, if we look at trade data, it hasn't been as well severe as was expected, perhaps back in April or May toward the beginning of the lockdown. Garment exports from Cambodia have decreased by 9%, which is considerably less than the export decreases back in 2008, 2009 with the global financial crisis. So the expectation was much worse, but it hasn't been as severe. Many reasons for that. First of all is the continued demand for low cost apparel. People at home, working from home like all of us, are buying sweatpants and hoodies and stuff like that, or whatever, these lower cost kinds of goods, which Cambodia effectively specializes in. Secondly, there haven't been widespread lockdowns in the case of Cambodia. The impact of COVID in terms of the infections in Cambodia has been minimal up until now. And lastly, there hasn't been a great interruption of supply of inputs from China, except for the first couple of months when the lockdowns were taking place in China. And this is enabled by Cambodia's close geopolitical relations with China. That said, buyers have used, international buyers, we all know them, H&M and others, have been using the pandemic to drive down prices. Essentially, a large number of manufacturers have fewer orders, so they're competing with one another, and this is driving their costs down. And many buyers are using this to get stuff produced more cheaply. Secondly, many buyers are extending payment terms from 30 days up to even 120 days. So what this means is a manufacturer in Cambodia is effectively financing a buyer in Europe or North America. Having said all of that, so on the surface with many of these things, it seems that things haven't been that severe, but it actually has been for workers. Some 35 to 40,000 workers out of roughly 800,000 employed in the garment industry in Cambodia have lost their jobs. Again, this isn't as big of a number as there was back in 2008 and 2009. However, many workers, we don't have data on it, are experiencing work slowdowns or far fewer hours, factory suspensions, these kinds of things. And this has had, dramatic impacts on the lives of many thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of workers even. Studies have come out from the Workers' Rights Consortium and other organizations about workers compromising basic nutrition so that they're able to save enough money to pay rent and remit and various other things like that. debts are mounting, as are defaults on existing loans, and work pressure in factories that are continuing to work has been ramped up, and attention to many labor standards, which had made a bit of progress over the years in Cambodia, are now pushed to the side. And now people are thinking just about getting orders, getting work, and things like that. So, getting sufficient maternity leave or ensuring transparent overtime pay, these sorts of things are essentially shifted to the back burner. So these socioeconomic hardships can spell disaster for many garment factory workers. I can't shift to the next page. What's going on? Sorry, let me try this again. I don't know why it won't allow me to move on to the next page. Oh, there we go. Sorry. I don't have a lot of time to get into this, but in August of 2020, the European Union withdrew its everything but arms market access for some 20 to 30% of exports from Cambodia. This was the culmination of a several-year process of negotiations and pressure, and effectively the EU was trying to pressure the Cambodian government to return to some form of multi-party democracy. This didn't have the desired impact. In fact, the Cambodian government has shifted to deeper relations with the Chinese state, and it has deepened suspicions or apprehensions, you can see, on the part of the Cambodian state to Western European governments and the US and others. One of the implications of this is it's pushing labor rights issues further into this authoritarian realm, away from the liberal norms, which had taken some root in Cambodia over the years. A continuation of the curtailment or even elimination of things like the right to strike, which has been one of workers' most powerful tools to actuate some kind of improvement in their work condition. Freedom of association has also been curtailed, and it's increasingly risky for trade unionists in Cambodia to do anything that may be deemed to be in opposition to the ruling party, with the risk of imprisonment and court cases and various other things of that sort. So we see different decrees during the COVID time on the part of the Cambodian state as it pertains to freedom of association and other basic rights of workers. Another thing that has been exposed during this COVID time in terms of the sourcing strategies and manufacturing patterns really at the Asia regional scale is the change that has very slowly, gradually been taking place in the global apparel industry. Essentially, manufacturers at the bottom, so to speak, are getting bigger and bigger. They're increasingly part of Asian transnational manufacturing corporations with headquarters in Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and others. Many of these companies have existed for a while, but they're consolidating, they're expanding. Many of these less competitive, more independent one-off firms in places like Cambodia are going out of business. And another round of closures have taken place during the COVID pandemic. What this means is many of these manufacturing TNCs are increasingly profitable and thus have increasing capacity to employ workers on better terms if workers have the organizational and institutional capacity to make demands. On the other hand, we see firms that are doubling down on the sweatshop strategy in a renewed race to the bottom. So these companies producing for Walmart or some of these really cheap retailers are not going away. And these are not, generally speaking, the kinds of buyers these more profitable TNCs are producing for. Where Cambodia is positioned in all of this remains to be seen. Diversification has failed to materialize in the Cambodian economy as a whole, meaning away from garment manufacturing as being the mainstay toward electronics or auto or things like that. That's failed to materialize. And secondly, Cambodia is still stuck in this low value added accumulation regime of low-cost garments for, like T-shirts and trousers and things of this sort with a limited value added. And it seems unlikely that Cambodia is going to be able to shift out of this accumulation regime in the short term. I see that my time is up, so I'll just leave it there. I think that sufficiently covers what I wanted to touch upon. So I would like to pass the mic over to Pham Quynh Phuong from the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences.
Can you turn your microphone on, Phil?
I don't know why it cannot be shared, is it? Do you see anything? Sorry.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, we see it.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, is it okay? Yeah, thank you very much, Dennis, and thanks to the organizers for giving me this chance to talk briefly about my research. It is about the rise of LGBT movement in Vietnam and how the state responded to it. The Communist Party state of Vietnam has emerged as one of the most progressive countries in Asia on LGBT issues. The state has lifted up the ban on gay marriage and allowed the sex reassignment surgery for transgender. Vietnam was also among the first countries in Asia where same-sex marriage was seriously considered at the national parliament. The government has voted in favor of the UN resolution on anti-discrimination against LGBT people, despite the majority of Southeast Asian nations retaining their hostility to homosexuals. So this is surprising in light of the common perception that the Vietnamese state is intolerant of civil society activism and imprinted with socially conservative Confucian values. The LGBT movement started in 2008 with the efforts of one local NGO that tried to connect dispersed groups of gay, lesbian, and transgender through web-based forums, and the formation of the first LGBT organization in 2009. And it quickly became a phenomenon in social life. The public visibility of LGBT is surprising because for Vietnamese people, sexuality is often seen as private and personal issue, and the spontaneous crowd in public are often seen as potential disruptive or a threat to the regime. Apparently, there have been significant changes in the last 10 years. Until the 2000s, LGBT people were still considered as the disease and social evils that pursuing Western lifestyle and disruptive to traditional morality. But less than 10 years later, the Justice Minister declared homosexuals were human beings too, and the right to get married is the right of human beings. So one would say that the LGBT people was socially recognized. But in terms of legal recognition, it has been more ambiguous. The current marriage and family law removed a previous article banning same-sex marriage, replacing it with no recognition. It means that the authorities will not give fine and ban the weddings, but same-sex couple will not be recognized legally, and therefore will not have any rights associated with legal marital status. In a similar way, Although already passed the right to sex redefinition, the transgender law and subsequent decrees has continued to be delayed, making the right of transgender is only recognized in theory. So one might ask, why has the LGBT movement been tolerated? And why the state's attitude has changed toward LGBT, and why this change doesn't lead to the full recognition of LGBT? Because of the time, I want to just mention very briefly the context that had the rise of LGBT movement in Vietnam. So including the renovation policy has created a condition for social change. The role of internet, actually the NG people said that without internet, there could be no LGBT movement in Vietnam. The role of international NGOs and international donors, and the setup of many Vietnamese local NGOs. And also the development of international LGBT movement also have great impact on LGBT in Vietnam. And five, there was no religious objection, actually. This is quite different. The influential religions in Vietnam, including Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, actually have paid very little attention to these issues, while in other countries, Christianity and Islam firmly oppose homosexualities. Meanwhile, the popular local religions in Vietnam, which is the spirit possession, spirit mediumship, in fact, gave a great respect to the gender divergence. But the success of the movement also resulted from the activist strategy that emotion, sentiments, and relationship have played a very important role. That was the empathy strategy that invoked the communal values of traditional culture, the non-confrontational approach, the positive attitude with language of equality and love, but not the language of human rights, which often considered as sensitive to the regime, and the strategy of building trust and relationship with policymakers. So with this strategy, there was the responses from policymakers are quite positive. There was sympathetic response, and removing the ban on same-sex marriage can be seen as expression of this sympathy. A perception of non-threatening LGBT, the state, the policymakers, they think of LGBT people as people who cannot threat the regime or they don't see the danger. And also the socialist law-making tradition that want to cover all groups of society to prove the state attention to the entire people actually has motivated the lawmakers to initiate a reapproachment to the communities. And especially, I want to emphasize that there has been an aspiration for change. The LGBT actually has seen as a symbol for modernity and progress. In the new context, the concerns of Western country influence that happened after Vietnam just opened the country has diminished, giving way to the modern and progressive aspiration that the Vietnamese government pursued. So, but with this kind of progressive move, but the final decision, which appear in the current law of marriage and family, the final decision to show no prohibition but no recognition, however, show the continuing hesitation of the state in dealing with cultural embedded issues. The marriage and family and having children to continue the family line are still considered as a core value of the Vietnamese traditional of Vietnamese society. Another reason is that the rise of LGBT people cannot be met if it has a potential to affect the social morality and the population growth of the country. So I would come to very quick conclusions regarding the state. First, the behavior of the Vietnamese state is more complicated than the oversimplified liberal authoritarian. The state always knows how to recognize danger and selectively decides what should be addressed, what should be ignored, and what should be repressed. Although it remains hostile to civil society in theory, the party state allows civil society to function in a way that is manageable or only to operate in areas that do not directly touch the political power of the state. The state is likely to tolerate and even accommodate some concerns and demands if it does not view the latter as threats for the political regime. Second, I'd like to emphasize that using ambiguous language is a way to govern. No prohibition, but no recognitions. No objections, but no acceptance. These kinds of governance strategy create a gray space open enough for flexibility, but also ambiguous enough for tightening when necessary. And finally, this case of Lgbt movement also reveals the complexity of the state in Vietnam. The state is neither a homogeneous and autonomous entity, nor separated from the state, from the society. The state actions are caused by specific people with emotion and social relations. The struggle of LGBT's movement for recognition help us understand some cultural and political dimension of the relationship between the state and civil society in Vietnam today. Yeah, thank you for listening. And I would like to hand over to Cornelio for his presentation in the WP4. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pham. If I may share my own slides now. Good evening, everyone. Hello from Manila. My name is Jayeel. I'm from the Ateneo, the Manila University. In the next 10 minutes, allow me to share with you my presentation on religion and the war on drugs in the Philippines. We are interested in the war on drugs because this has been the policy of President Duterte since 2016 when he became president. As our argument in this publication that we had in 2019, it is also important for analysts, observers to take into consideration the role of religion in underpinning the popular support for the war on drugs. So in as much as there is a political reason or political motivation for the public support for the war on drugs and other forms of anti-criminality in the country, religion must also be brought in precisely because the country is one of the most religious societies in the world based on certain surveys. Give you a context. When President Duterte was running for elections, this was in 2016, this was his statement in one of his public speeches. Criminals, I go after them. As long as I do it in accordance with the rules of law, I will continue to kill criminals. If I become president, it will be bloody. Ladies and gentlemen, it has indeed been bloody. In 2019, about 5,500, according to official government reports, have already been killed in the wake of the drug war. Obviously, by now, this is much higher, the figure is much higher, but media coverage has declined in favor of other issues, including COVID, as we all know. Also, the statistical data might vary depending on whom you interview. If you talk to human rights activists, ladies and gentlemen, you will see that the figures might be much higher. So the Human Rights Watch, if I'm not mistaken, reports it pegs it at about 20,000 or so. How popular is the war on drugs? Again, just context for you all to make sense of our project. By September 2018, 2 years into his presidency, 76% of Filipinos were satisfied with the war on drugs. Even recent surveys show that the support for the war on drugs remains to be high, and we expect that come elections in 2022, we will have a new president by next year. Anti-criminality will still be a very big issue up there. So what did we do for our project? This is a very small scale project. Our qualitative work led us to a small community which has the biggest red circle there on the upper right part of your screen called Payatas. It's a small urban poor community in Quezon City where Ateneo is. But it is among the hotspots for the war on drugs. The bigger the red circle, the more people that have been killed in the area. And again, this are reports from 2019. So, and we know that the war on drugs, the policy is still in place, and people are still being killed even though they don't get reported in the media anymore. What did we do? In the course of our fieldwork, we were simply interested only in the Catholic Church, because our project at the time was really, what did the Catholic Church do to respond to the war on drugs? But in the course of our fieldwork, we discovered that there are far more religious organizations on the ground: Baptists, Protestants, evangelicals, new religious movements, what have you, they're there. So in a way, this community is a microcosm of the religious diversity that is the Philippines. Yes, I know that 80% of Filipinos are Catholic, but on the ground, religious diversity is far more evident than the statistical data are able to provide us. People know that one neighbor, this neighbor is Catholic, one neighbor is born-again Christian, another neighbor is Jehovah's Witness, and so forth. So we interviewed their religious leaders, and I'm going to present to you what we picked up from the perspectives of these religious leaders, and presumably these are ideas that they're also echoing in their own congregations. The idea is that drug users and the phenomenon of drug use is being theologized. Either they are sinners or victims. Either they are sinners or victims. Sinner from the point of view of religious leaders, drug users are sinners because they have fallen short of the glory of God, using the Bible, for example. And so therefore, whatever they are facing in the hands of the state and law enforcers, they deserve. This is really the punishment that they're getting for being sinful creatures who are also criminals. And mind you, for the record, drug use is not the only problem per se. For many of these religious leaders and the public in general, drug use, illegal substance abuse is problematic because it leads to other crimes, including stealing and murder and so forth. So that, of course, is a very simplistic discourse, but that is the state discourse nevertheless, and it's being echoed by your religious leaders. But there's a minority report, and this has to do with framing drug users as victims. We realize that there are 1 or 2 or 3 pastors and priests, Catholic priests, who would say that no, drug users are not sinners, they're victims. They are resorting to substance abuse precisely because of their social and economic conditions. No time to unpack that, but let me just share with you some of the qualitative inputs that we got from our interviews. The first is from a Baptist preacher. His argument is this: society is eroding. These are sinners. They're flourishing. God needed to appoint Duterte in order to get Filipinos to repent. There are more theological and biblical justifications for this, especially for this Baptist preacher, but you will find them in the publication. For an evangelical pastor that we interviewed, he was saying that the use of illegal drugs is a form of wickedness that must be fought at all costs. So you have that religious rhetoric that underpins the support for their own support for the war on drugs. So what have they been doing? Last part of the presentation, there are 2 categories. For some religious groups, to them, the response is spiritual, converting people, turning them around, helping drug users to reform, and hopefully they would leave their old lifestyle. And this has been really the dominant form of response by our religious leaders. But there's also the social and political. Catholic priests and some evangelical pastors have taken to the streets to really protest. Of course, endangering their own presence in the community, because what they do is not necessarily popular. And even right now, 2021, anybody who criticizes this administration is easily red tagged. A colloquial term that we use here to refer to, what the government does to associate people, including academics like myself, with the communists, enemies of the state, in effect. According to this local pastor, it is God's design that there is law and order in society. For example, we prohibit We prohibit jaywalking because we don't want anyone to die because of accidents. If you were law-abiding, you would be safe from any of these accidents. And you have to realize that the law of the land has God's anointing. There is no law on earth meant to harm people. You look for one that hurts people, you will not find any, never. Bold assertion on the part of this local pastor. It is what it is. And yet we have discovered that some religious leaders are far more reflexive. This Catholic priest argues that once a leader does not respect life, you are to topple him down. But again, this is a minority report. Ladies and gentlemen, I have presented to you some of the findings from our project, which has, interestingly, in the course of our CRISEA project, engendered some spin-offs. This one, for example, with Ia, a colleague of mine at the Ateneo, focusing this time on megachurch Christianity. Also, this was published in 2019, so because the project was all happening at the same time. But later on, we started investigating the rhetoric of the Catholic Church. Apparently, since the 1970s, the Catholic Church officially has been making statements about substance abuse in the country. This was at the time of our dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. Already at that time, substance abuse was being demonized by the state, and in many ways, the Catholic Church also piggybacked on that demonization. And our provocative proposition in this piece is that a religion also facilitated the prevalence of that moral panic. Finally, my colleagues Aaron and Bianca have come up with this chapter, which will appear in the collection that Volker and I are editing as part of our deliverables for VP4. What they're doing is they're relating the anti-criminality campaign in the Philippines with that in other parts of Southeast Asia. So again, tracing the contours of the illiberal turn, or the authoritarian turn, if you will, around the region, specifically focused on anti-criminality. So I end there, and let's now go to Myanmar. We pass this on to A.A. Miat, who is at the University of Mandalay. A.A., thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayeel, for giving me the chance to speak me. Okay, let's share my PowerPoints. Good afternoon from Myanmar. I will present on behalf of our group. The title of our group is Southeast Asia Regionalism and Myanmar's Relations with ASEAN. The purpose of our research is to explain Myanmar's relations with ASEAN in the light of Southeast Asia regionalism. The recent military coup in Myanmar is used as a case study. These are our research questions. How did ASEAN push Myanmar in her political reform process since 1990s? And how did ASEAN members respond to the recent military coup in Myanmar? This slide shows Southeast Asia regionalism. For widening the regional integration, ASEAN enlarged its members from 6 to 10. To deepen the regional integration, the three pillars of ASEAN community are the most crucial areas for the evolution of ASEAN. Political cooperation, shared political norms and values are very important for the ASEAN political security community. This slide shows the norms and principles to guide relations among the member states. ASEAN has been adhering to the non-interference principle under the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are the principles of the Bali Concord II and ASEAN Charter. This slide illustrates ASEAN's role in Myanmar's political reform process. ASEAN pushed the Myanmar military government by using the works that constructive engagement, quiet diplomacy, the personal relationship, and enhanced interaction. Okay, let's now move on to about recent military coup in Myanmar. On February 1st, 2021, The military seized the political power by giving the reasons of the election fraud a poll. So the military formed the State Administration Council, SAC. But the military rejected the usage of the word coup by declaring a 5-point roadmap, including the holding of free and fair general election after 1 year state of emergency. And I will express the ASEAN chairman's statement by citing the ASEAN Charter. Brunei issues the ASEAN chairman's statement that one point is the return to normalcy in accordance with the will and interests of the people of Myanmar. This slide shows the foreign policy of the State Administration Council. Senior General Miao Lai stated in his speech that foreign policy remains unchanged under the State Administration Council. He pledged to hold the multi-party election after 1 year state of emergency and transfer the political power to the winning party. And he also expressed that the State Administration Council have never deviated from the way of democracy, but the people of Myanmar totally don't believe on them. This slide shows the individual ASEAN members' response to the military coup. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore stated that ASEAN should use the constructive engagement and non-interference principles. They said to help Myanmar instead of condemning the coup. And they also against the widespread sanctions. Indonesia has called for Myanmar to adhere to the ASEAN Charter. Thailand and Cambodia stated that Myanmar's case is only internal affairs, but Vietnam, the Philippines, and Brunei demanded stability and status quo. They advised to make dialogue, reconciliation, and the return to normalcy, referring to the principles and the ASEAN Charter. This slide is Myanmar's trust in ASEAN. Myanmar leaders have appreciated ASEAN's policies of constructive engagement and non-interference principle in its internal affairs, which is the main factor behind Senior General Tan Sri's decision to join ASEAN in 1997. Myanmar needs strong regional organizations like ASEAN. Our conclusion is that Myanmar's military, that is the SAC, State Administration Council, appreciates the ASEAN's constructive approach to its internal affairs. As a member of ASEAN, Myanmar will have to follow the norms and the Bali Concord II and ASEAN Charter. However, it's early to conclude whether Myanmar follows the norms and rules and the Bali Concord II and ASEAN Charter. Thank you so much for your attention. Now, I will hand over my floor to Silvia Vignato from University Manalo.
Thank you very much. Nyat. Am I good? Okay. So I am just going to very briefly introduce CRISEA program in films, because CRISEA has aimed to produce visual research and communication as a privileged way to combine different disciplines, methods, and perspectives, and styles of communication, and styles of joint collaboration. So it's a complex process of research. And this is why through this networking, which is on-site networking, is cross-boundary networks, we have been able to create a series of lively portrait of important, I would say, fundamental questions for Southeast Asia. And we have been able to do that from a multiple angle. For example, from an environmentalist angle, like in Monica Arne's Flow of Sand, a film which considers the effects of land reclamation in Malaysia, the social effect, or a micro-history level like Rachel Leow, which you're going to watch after I've finished, or even an approach to identity construction in Jan van der Putten's film about Malay identity in Leow, which is examined through context of chanting of epics. Or again, my own film, which is called Aceh After, where we step into the dynamic between memories of war and deindustrialization in one of Indonesia's major former gas-producing plants. And finally, we have an overarching view by Sophie Boisseau du Rocher, who can provide hints as to what historical and political drives of present ASEAN are. So on the whole, the 5 films are strongly grounded in methodology and scientifically sound, but capable of drawing interest and curiosity. And we know that visual communication, especially when it's easily accessible through the internet, as our films are going to be, is sought for both by non-specialists and by specialists, and any teacher or lecturer or political advisor knows this. So I am very happy to see the overall visual production of CRISEA, and I hope that more will come, and and I'm very curious to see what will come out of this. And just to give you a demonstration, I give the screen to Rachel Leow, who is introducing her film, Chinese Go Home. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Silvia. I'm just going to share my screen and I hope it will work. Okay. Great. Okay, so good morning to my fellow panelists and CRISEA organizers, colleagues, and whoever else is watching. It's a real pleasure to be here today to present my web documentary, which is a historical film. So my film, Chinese Go Home, draws on some of my research for CRISEA to tell a largely untold story of deportations during the Malayan emergency. It is set in the early years of the Malayan emergency from 1948 to the early 1950s, when over 20,000 people were deported from what was then British Malaya to China. And both of these countries were at the time embroiled in war and revolution. Malaya at the time was in the throes of a civil war between the waning British imperial administration and anti-colonial communist revolutionaries. And China too was in the midst of a civil war between the Chinese communists and the Kuomintang, and would soon become two Chinas, separated along hardening Cold War lines. My film tells the story of this extraordinarily complex historical moment through the stories of two women, Quynh and Bettina, whose grandfather and grandaunt, respectively, were among those deported around this time. Apart from its general historical concern with the state and the way state-making happens against designated internal enemies, as well as the making of multiple states, new states during the Cold War, my film also speaks really nicely to the three main transversal themes of the project, migration, security, and gender, as well as exemplifying one of the central CRISEA methodologies, which is the dialogue between macro and micro perspectives on the region. The themes of migration and security, I think, are obvious enough from the topic. It's, after all, a film about the forced deportation of Chinese migrants for stated security reasons, that they were communist terrorists and criminals. Although, as I explore in the film, this was true only to a certain extent. For instance, one of the deportees featured in my film, Bettina's grand-aunt, was not a migrant, but was local born. And so migration and security are central themes, but are certainly not the whole story. So I wanted to dwell a little bit more on why my film is a gendered story. And there are at least two reasons. Firstly, it's a micro-historical story about the breaking up of families by big macro-historical processes, civil war, Cold War, and decolonization. While the histories of this era tend to be very focused on the actions of men and of male deportees in particular, it's clear that these men were at all times embedded in gendered relationships. These were men with wives, with parents, sons and daughters, whose histories were bound up with theirs, but often obscured in the historical record. And these relationships appear even in the most conventionally masculine, hyper-patriotic memoirs of the period. And I feature one of these in the film, a memoir written by a man who spent many years in prison awaiting the resolution of his expulsion case, and who describes in this short clip a common reality for many of his fellow deportee inmates. So I hope you can hear the sound.
有些难友被通知驱逐出境，要求妻子一起同行，妻子不答应，无奈的只好一个人启程。
So therefore, families were basically broken up in that manner.
I hope you were able to hear the sound on that. Please let me know if you didn't, and I will try to fix it. So that's the theme about the breaking up of families. The second theme of gender is that my film tries to recover this history primarily through the memory work of women. As I said earlier, it features two women, Quynh and Bettina, both of whom are descendants who are grasping at generationally distant memories of their deported family members. And so in featuring female voices and the historical memories that they articulate, I wanted to gesture to critical omissions in the largely male-written record of the emergency in general, and of the experiences and consequences of deportation in particular. Alongside these women, these descendants, the film also features two local historians, Dr. Lau Chu-Chin and Professor Danny Wong, the latter of whom you saw briefly in the last clip, or three, if you count me, the historian narrator. And this brings me to a third point, which is that throughout the film, the line between historian and descendant becomes increasingly blurred. There's a tension throughout the film that I wanted to play with and convey between memory and history. I wanted to play a couple of clips for you just to illustrate this point. The first clip is of Bettina, and she's introducing here her grand-aunt Siok Ai and the circumstances of Siok Ai's deportation.
Siok Ai was always referred to as the communist auntie. She was certainly known for having a very hot temper. She was universally known among the family as being very, very clever. But she had made an absolute nuisance of herself, and so she was put on a ship, and pictures were painted that she went on this ship defiantly, waving her little red book and singing revolutionary songs all the way to China.
So both Bettina and Quynh, as we'll see in a bit, tell their stories from frustrating distance. And this is clear even from that short clip by Bettina. In her narration, Siok Ai is always referred to, or she was known for, or pictures were painted of her departure. Bettina at no point can make a personal claim to that memory. She can never say, I remember that Siok Ai was like this, because she never met Siok Ai herself. Perhaps most pointedly, the historians among us will know that Siok Ai could not have been waving the iconic Little Red Book in 1948, since Mao's book was only created in the early 1960s in the lead up to the Cultural Revolution. But this is Bettina's prevailing memory of Siok Ai, and that makes this memory a historical artifact in itself. And so I chose to include it and in fact to honor it artistically in the title graphic among all the other fragments of the visible past that will appear throughout the film. So the second clip I'll show is of Quyhn's story of her grandfather after he was deported from Malaya in 1948, and of his arrival in China during the height of the civil war between the Kuomintang and the communists, as well as his tragic death in 1949.
Strangely enough, my grandfather's name only showed up in the papers in Taipei. He was deported to Shantou, and then he made his way back to the village. And because he was highly educated Hua Qiao, with good credentials, having been part of the leftist movement overseas in a Xiongdi Dang, he was coming down mountain to pick up a letter of appointment to be an official in the local, soon-to-be communist government. And unfortunately, he met with KMT and was wrestled. His gun fell out, and then he was arrested by the KMT. We don't know how long he was in prison in Songkou, but eventually, as the KMT were retreating towards Taiwan, they apparently went through the mountains in our area, and he was marched halfway and had a leg injury or something, and then allegedly was in a mass execution. His death was really a turning point in the family's history, really.
So as you can see there as well, Quyhn's story is also told from a distance, but not just told from a distance. You know, she too never met her grandfather, but it's also stochastic. This story was just one of 2 or 3 versions of the mythologized story of her grandfather's death and martyrdom in Songkou, which she shared with me when I interviewed her. And all of them were second or third hand stories, even rumors. It was my choice as filmmaker to present one version over the others. And it is her prerogative, as she said in her interviews with me, that it's not her intention to reconstruct the truth of what happened so much as to understand and express the connection that she had with this man and the history that he embodied, a history which lies nonetheless generationally out of her reach. Eric Hobsbawm wrote in his Age of Empire of a twilight zone between history and memory, a blurred no man's land of time that stretches from the furthest living memory you have access to right down to your own historical consciousness. So as much as my film is about Chinese deportations and state making in the mid-20th century and about migration and security and gender, I also hope it stands as an expression of the complexities of history and memory and a reminder of the weight of the narrative choices we make, not just as historians or filmmakers, but also as individuals and narrators of our own pasts. So I wanted to convey something of this too, of the dance between history and memory that characterizes Quyhn's and Bettina's story from this mid-20th century era, as new generations of Southeast Asians begin to reckon with an increasingly distant, but still incredibly formative historical past. For this is a period of time which, after all, lies as much in their twilight zone as it does in mine, and perhaps also as it does in yours. So thank you for your attention and for allowing me to share my film with you. The whole film will be available for viewing on YouTube, and I'll also be doing several screenings and discussions around it in the coming months. So please do get in touch for further details if you are interested. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that fascinating set of insights. It's now my pleasure to start panel 4 in the second half of the conference, and to ask 2 colleagues to comment on the project and its findings. Michael Montesano of the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, who will speak about its research agenda, and Terence Gomez of the University of Malaya, who will comment on its dissemination strategy. Michael, over to you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I take it you can all hear me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this wrap-up conference for CRISEA. I should say that, like Andrew, I'm an historian, and that's going to be reflected in my comments about research results and networking this evening. I'm struck as I look at the concerns of CRISEA and at its research results, especially speaking as an historian, at how prominent ASEAN is in the concerns of the project. I want to start my remarks tonight by going back to 6 years before the inauguration of ASEAN rather, to 1961, when the historian John Smale published an article in what was then the Journal of Southeast Asian History on the possibility of an autonomous history of modern Southeast Asia. This appeared in a number of the journal that was devoted to papers that had been given at the first International Conference of Southeast Asian Historians. And I mention this article and Smale's ideas today for two reasons. One is to talk about the contributors to that volume of the journal 60 years ago. They included scholars from Cornell University, Yale University, unsurprisingly, the Australian National University. Along with London, these institutions were the major poles for the study of Southeast Asia in the Anglophone world at the time. Of course, all the contributors to that number of the journal were historians, and almost all of them were men. They formed a network of the sort that Southeast Asian studies has always been grounded in, a network that was composed of people who shared mentors, who shared experiences of language study, who shared experience of research in the field. Of course, they also shared intellectual concerns in their work on the Southeast Asian region. Even at the time of the publication of Smale's article 60 years ago, however, the seeds of the growth of the network were already apparent. The journal in which it was published, after all, was published in Singapore. Contributors to that number of the journal included a scholar at the University of Indonesia in Jakarta and another scholar at the Indian School of International Studies. 60 years later, the achievements of CRISEA illustrate just how those seeds have flourished. While the project's work has been in English, and while, as the example of the FAO itself reminds us, the study of Southeast Asia was never an exclusively Anglophone undertaking, the roster of scholars who have participated in CRISEA underlines not so much the dispersal of expertise on the region, so much as the reach of the network that, with their shared concerns, binds Southeast Asianists today. We have scholars in the project coming from long active centers like the universities of Malaya, of Köln, of Hamburg. We have sites where impressive concentrations of scholars are impossible to overlook, like Naples, Lodz, and Chiang Mai. And we have prestigious institutions that did not in the past deign to devote resources to the study of the region, like Cambridge. Finally, we have places like Picardy and Monash, not the Monash in Clayton, Melbourne, but the one in Subang Jaya, to which we very clearly now need to begin to pay attention in our understanding of the network that connects students of Southeast Asia. To review the results of CRISEA is to suspect very strongly that the networks of scholars involved in this project actually already existed before the project was launched. How could that network have not existed already, given those scholars' shared concerns? At the same time, the project has doubtless strengthened the ties that hold this network together, and one imagines that it's also given rise to the strong possibility that participating scholars will draw in due course their own students into this same network of scholarship on the region. As what is only the tiny sliver of scholars involved in the project who identify as historians makes clear, the network incorporates researchers from an ever-expanding range of disciplines as well. And this is the second reason for my reference to John Smale's article of 6 decades ago. That article paid explicit attention to the realms of Southeast Asian history in which Southeast Asian agency, as it was thought of at the time, was most evident. The article invited comparison among instances of agency across the region and prodded Smale's fellow historians to think about how those instances were integrated into something coherent at the level of the region. As I've reviewed the results of CRISEA research, work package by work package, I'm struck by a healthy tension between dimensions of the research that stimulate comparison among different parts of the region, on the one hand, and on the other, dimensions of that work that mandate attention to what ties the region together, not merely through common experiences, but rather through interconnected or integrated experiences. For example, CRISEA research makes clear that the role of the state in economic life and the experience of precarity in Southeast Asian societies may demonstrate great commonalities, but they are experiences that are best understood at the level of individual states and society. In contrast, the clearly related phenomena of FDI-led industrialization with its interest in supply chains, industrial parks where we see Southeast Asian firms establishing facilities in neighboring countries, transnational labor migration. These are all developments that unmistakably integrate different parts of the region rather than merely prodding an interest in comparing different parts of the region. Similarly, notions of political legitimacy addressed by the project, impulses toward authoritarianism, also addressed in one of the work packages, appear to reflect largely national dynamics. But developments like the fight for LGBT rights and the role of members, for example, of the Society of Jesus and the emergence of national identities are not only common experiences, but in fact experiences that integrate the region. To these latter experiences that integrate the region, we might add, as we look at the results of CRISEA research, the ideas and goals of millennials across Southeast Asia, the indigenous movement in the region, large firms' intra-Asian investments, the work of Filipino missionaries in Thailand and of skilled Filipino workers in Singapore, migrant seafood sector workers in Thailand, and the full range of those who live and work along and who sometimes cross Southeast Asia's many borders. Two areas of CRISEA research call with particular clarity for scholarship on regional integration that works at both the micro and the macro levels. One of these is the environment. As one reads the CRISEA research on the environment concerning rivers, seas, forests, cities, and the air, and above all because of the scale of the causes of these problems, it's very clear that while the impact of these problems is vividly captured at the micro level, there is simply no way for the policymaker, to whom so much of this research is addressed, to address these problems without understanding the need to view the region in an integrated manner and to tackle these problems at the macro level. The second area in which CRISEA research calls particularly clearly for scholarship on regional integration is, of course, in CRISEA's thoughtful and clear-headed approach to the often puzzling concept of ASEAN centrality. In that work, it's impossible not to see the importance of grounding the association's aspiration to integrate the region in close understanding of the variety of the states that make the region up. With that, I thank you for the privilege of speaking to this wrap-up conference of CRISEA and pass the torch to Terence Gomez from the University of Malaya.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, let me begin by first stating that I want to focus my attention solely on the issue of dissemination and dialogue that transpired over the course of this research project. Now,
when I talk about dissemination here, I would like to be very clear. We had three primary objectives when we started this project. First, identify areas of competition. Second, encourage macro-micro dialogue, a point which Michael just alluded to. And the third point was about the dissemination of our findings. When it came to the issue of the dissemination of the findings, the emphasis here was this: how do we establish mechanisms of communication and dialogue with different segments of society? And I stress here the point, different segments of society. We are not just speaking to fellow academics. We are not only speaking to bureaucrats, but we also wanted to touch people, to address these issues, bring it to their attention, to engage, to then stimulate public debate, to engage them in public debate. These research outcomes, I would argue, had to have an impact. They had to have an impact specifically on policymakers if our research was to have any meaning. So here I would like to show you the different dissemination methods that we had. The first one was workshops, and I'll take you through them. The other were newsletters. And we also had documentaries, and you have seen one now, which Rachel just presented to us, policy briefs, books, and I should add articles, academic articles, and finally media presentations. I'd like to start with the CRISEA workshop events. Now, Jacques earlier in the evening mentioned these workshop events that we had here. This is a table which outlines these workshops that we had. But I'd like to speak specifically of the one that we had in Kuala Lumpur, the one which I convened. And here I speak now to the issue of how we use this dissemination workshop to address the points that I said earlier. How do we reach out to different segments of society? So what we did here was we organized this with the EU office in Kuala Lumpur. Also involved in the organization of this dissemination conference was a government think tank, Khazanah National, and they were brought in as a mechanism to influence public policy. This conference was well attended. It comprised academics, bureaucrats, as well as people from international bodies such as the World Bank and the United Nations. Importantly, too, we also had people from the media. At this workshop, what we did was we had two main mechanisms of dissemination knowledge of our research findings. First, a documentary, The Flow of Sand. The Flow of Sand focused primarily on China's investment in Malaysia, looking at infrastructure projects. The impact of this video was phenomenal in the sense that people could visualize the problem of the concept of development. The so-called development had led to serious displacement of people and a complete violation of the environment. The second part of the conference was on the research findings of China's investments from a more academic point of view. And here, a large volume of data was presented about the implications of China's vast investment flows into just one country, Malaysia. But we also discussed other countries too in Southeast Asia. Now, what is important about this dissemination workshop was the impact it had in terms of the dissemination of information. I'll come to that later. But first, I want to get to this, policy briefs. Now, in terms of dissemination of information, here we are looking now at publications, policy briefs. Policy briefs are important because if you look at the policy briefs that CRISEA produced, they were brief, as stated here. It was written in an accessible style. It was easy to understand the point that was being made by the researchers. And most of all, it gave recommendations. Recommendations which at a quick glance, you could see now what had to be done. And it could, as Michael also pointed out, it was, while it may have focused on particular countries, the implications of this on the region as a whole was quite evident in these policy briefs. Now, the list of policy briefs, I'm not going to take you through them. You can get them at the website. But what is clear is that each work produced at least 3 policy briefs. And these policy briefs deal with all the key themes of the CRISEA project. What is also important here is this, and here I would like to spend some time on this. This is unusual. While we had academic articles, which basically was for fellow academics, this is unusual in the sense that we came out also with books. Now, I'm paying attention here to books because, as I said earlier, we also wanted to engage with the public. Now, while the Flow of Sense was also put on YouTube and was a form of engagement with the public, this was another form of engagement. Here we looked specifically at China. There are two books which have now come out, one entitled China and Malaysia, State Business Relations and the New Order of Investment Flows, and the other by Dominic on China's provinces and the Belt Road Initiative. The Belt Road Initiative has had a major impact on not just Southeast Asia, but Asia as a whole, and it's now well moving into Europe. The important point about the two books is, if you look at China and Malaysia, there were two editions. One, the hardback edition, which had an international audience, bureaucrats, academics in Europe and the rest of the world. But we also had a paperback edition, the bottom one, which was targeted at Southeast Asian readers. And what is important about this book was, while we could have come out with a thick volume, we instead came out with a slim volume with the hope of now producing 3 other books based on different segments of the economy. China has invested in various segments of the economy. This focuses only on the industrial sector. This book sold, the Malaysian edition, the Southeast Asian edition, sold for only 30 Malaysian ringgit. It's about €5, less than €5. And the good thing here is that because it was a slim volume, easy to read and cheap, affordable, it reached a large segment of the public. The book sold very well. Now, this is an interesting experiment that I felt worked out very well in terms of how we could then disseminate our research findings in an accessible way to the public. And what was the outcome? What was the impact of this? The book was well received, as was the dissemination conference. And here I would like to speak about the media. Now, one of the important points about this project was the need for us to engage with the media. If we were to make an impact through our research findings, we had to use the media to disseminate our findings. And while we came up with publications which captured what our research findings had produced, had to say, we needed the media now to publicize this. And here, as you can see, the book as well as the dissemination conference had a wide audience. International press, including the BBC, carried some of the research that we did. But we also had a local audience. And here, as you can see, I'm just giving you a segment of some of the news reports that were carried about the research findings that we produced. This is important because, as you can see here now, there was enormous attention given to the research findings. What were the implications of China's growing influence in the Malaysian economy, in Southeast Asia? How would China have an even major impact in the economies of the region because of the COVID crisis? After all, China is one economy that has come out of the COVID crisis quite well and is actively pushing its BRI initiative. What were the implications of all this? So there was an avenue to talk about it based on the research findings. I would also like to point out this. The other issue about publishing is you can now engage also with the media in the form of TV, actual debates on TV. So here's an example of one TV program where we had a debate about the book and the implications of the book, not just in Malaysia, but also in Southeast Asia. We also had radio interviews. Radio interviews were carried where we were grilled, literally, the breakfast grill on BFM in Malaysia, about the book studies. This grilling was good because it led to a further interrogation of the research that we had done. And I'm glad to say that we had a good audience for the research findings. There were other avenues, conferences, as I said, where this research was presented, where, as you can see here, other forms of dissemination through the media. Now, I'd like to end here with this point. There's more to come. I'm just showing you what has already been produced, but the research is still going on. It's coming to an end, so the analysis is still going on. And I'm sure that a lot more research will come out of the findings from our 4 work packages. I am looking forward to how these work package products can be disseminated, hopefully in this form that I've stated here. I do recognize one thing, there's still limitations to our knowledge. There's so much data to assess. But what is important is there has been now this engagement with ASEAN as a whole based on the 4 work packages findings. There's now been output which will now lead to debates in the public arena, which I would argue will probably have a public policy impact too. And hopefully the public policy impact will bring about changes to the problems that we have identified that need to be rectified. I'll end here now and let me pass it on now to Medelina. Medelina? Andrew?
Yeah, thank you, Terence. Good evening from Jakarta. So as a concluding remark, I'd like to say that it has been a fantastic experience for CSIS to join the CRISEA consortium in the last 3 years. Our scholars have engaged in the research and academic component of the project and the dissemination of the deliverables. Working closely with IVIO on project management, for us, it is a fresh approach in producing an excellent proposal, coordinating the project implementation, and rigorously controlling the output quality. This teamwork has been fundamental for the project success. We have all together engaged in intensive discussion and interaction with prominent experts in 12 other institutions across Europe and Southeast Asia. The interregional and interdisciplinary nature of the project has provided a unique professional experience, but most importantly has provided the chance to push the boundaries on what we have known so far on Southeast Asian issues and how it relates to one another. I'm of the opinion that working together to produce thorough comparative studies between our respective regions and its regional institution need to be done continuously, and this consortium has done precisely that. After all, sharing best practices on regional integration and tailor it into a fitting recommendation and solution is the core of policy relevant research. Finally, CSIS is grateful for the generous input and support from IVIO and our fellow consortium members in our collective effort to disseminate CRISEA's deliverables. We hope that this project's knowledge and result can be reached and be well accepted by broader audience, primarily by policymakers across Southeast Asia to make more informed policies and decisions. Thank you. And I pass on the screens to Sophie. Sophie, the screens is yours. Sophie Boisseau. Is she here?
I'm not sure she is. Sophie, if Sophie isn't here, then I suggest we move straight on to speak to Volker Grabowsky.
Yes, distinguished audience, dear colleagues and partners, it is a pleasure to share with you my reflections on the CRISEA project, whose work package on identity I had the honor to co-chair over the last 3 years. These years were most stimulating for me and all my colleagues in Hamburg, both at the university and at GIGA, who participated in this unique endeavor to explore crucial aspects of comparing regional integrations in Southeast Asia. Among the many strengths of CRISEA which come up into my mind, I would like to highlight the excellent cooperation among working groups, both with regard to scale and quality. Work packages organize dissemination and other workshops on specific topics. My own personal highlight in this respect was the dissemination workshop organized by our friends at the University of Mandalay in February last year. Short previous visits to the Shan areas not counted. This was my first trip to Myanmar. I fondly remember the hospitality of our Burmese friends, the efficient organization of the workshop, and the high quality of the papers presented. This happened at the beginning of an impending international crisis, namely the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic, the consequences of which we all still endure until present, clearly disclosed the ability and courage of CRISEA to respond to unforeseeable challenges. I'm particularly grateful to Tomas Larsson from Cambridge University for having taken the initiative to stimulate scholars across the CRISEA network to produce research papers on how governments and societies in Southeast Asia responded to the pandemic. Looking at Southeast Asia as a case in point was indeed a very attractive idea, as some countries in the region have been suffering tremendously, such as Indonesia and the Philippines, while others like Vietnam and Thailand were able to cope with this global challenge much better than most Western countries. I discussed the idea with a Cambodian PhD student of mine whose task in CRISEA had so far been to assist me in the retyping of handwritten Khmer language documents to embark on an analysis of Cambodia's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, with a special emphasis on how the pandemic engaged with the Khmer concepts and perceptions of identity. At this end, this distraction proved to be a blessing, as it gave us the opportunity to contribute to a wonderful dissemination workshop organized last month and a fruitful exchange of ideas with other CRISEA colleagues. To sum up, I very much appreciate how CRISEA managed to show flexibility and build on its habit of working together to master unprecedented challenges, changing them into assets. Thank you very much. And now I would hand over either to Sophie, if she has now arrived, or if not, then to Tomas Larsson.
Thank you very much, Volker. And thanks everyone, and hello from Cambridge. I'd like to first of all thank everyone involved in CRISEA, and especially those who have been involved in the work package on the stage, which I have co-led together with Phuong. Rather than reflect so much on what we have done, I'd like to use my 2 minutes to look a little bit towards the future. Specifically, I'd like to advocate for continued and deepened collaboration, and in particular, collaborative research that leads to co-authored publication. Co-authoring is more and more common in both the social sciences and in the humanities, and for good reasons, right? We all have different skills, different expertise, and often these are complementary. And although CRISEA is built around a large number of excellent individual research projects, some of which have been showcased here today, CRISEA has also provided a framework where such deep collaboration leading to co-authored publications has emerged in a more, let's say, spontaneous manner. So I'd like to point to the jointly authored paper on religious accommodation in Laos and Indonesia, which is part of the macro-micro dialogue series of working papers. And in our response to the pandemic, CRISEA team members decided to research and write academic papers, as Volker mentioned, and also policy briefs together. So please take a look at, for example, the briefs on the politics of pandemic control in Vietnam and on the role of city. Sorry. Where was I? Pandemic control in Vietnam, and then the role of city and community initiatives for post-pandemic recovery. I think it would be a good thing if we saw more of this kind of collaboration. So as CRISEA comes to an end, I want to encourage all the researchers in the CRISEA networks who have been involved in our joint efforts here to keep their eyes open for projects where co-authoring could make for a more compelling piece of research, and to reach out to colleagues in the CRISEA network to explore the possibilities for writing something together, jointly. And with an eye towards future projects on CRISEA's scale, one might perhaps think about ways of building in this kind of deep collaboration into the very architecture of the project in a more extensive way. That does, of course, present some new and specific challenges, but it could also be very rewarding, I think. Thank you very much. And with that, I will pass the floor to Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Is it okay? Yes. Thank you very much, Thomas, and hello to all of you. I just would like me to focus on the added value of team research, because after 3 years of exchanges and debates, our research proposes a revisited conceptual framework for ASEAN, which could be summarized as follows: forget about integration and focus on centrality. Integration is a word borrowed from the West and the EU experience, but it has no incidence on the true nature of the association. And indeed, ASEAN's greatest achievement has been in facilitating regional relationship with the major powers, as well as with international and regional groupings. And it has succeeded in defending its specific positioning on a world map. So ASEAN is truly a hub that resonates with Southeast Asia's traditional vocation of a crossroad. And that's where the notion of centrality is the real notion defining ASEAN. It is crucial to member states. It may have a potential effect on integration, but we should not be mistaken. This integrative effect is not the intention, but as mentioned, a side effect. And as such, it is only tolerated. So the success and interest of an ASEAN policy for the member state is measured by the impact on its own development and processes, not on the region as such. So ASEAN becomes a kind of interface, a functional center between the member states' perceived vulnerability, their inherent comparative advantage, and the outside world. So the association simultaneously allows the preservation of national interests and the defense of those interests on a regional scale. And it can be optimized as a negotiation space and platform. And we do hope it will be optimized as such a platform. Currently, in the case of the Burmese events, ASEAN might have a crucial role in bringing all stakeholders, into negotiation. So our recommendations to the EU are focus and reinforce ASEAN centrality, because perceptions give a coherence. The EU needs a resilient and a central ASEAN in a challenging Asian context. Obviously, the destabilization, marginalization, or erosion of ASEAN would lead to a highly detrimental disintegration process with direct repercussion on East Asian dynamics. And this only confirms that ASEAN matters. So second point, we have to coordinate our actions with many others, with Japan, India, Australia, the Quad, because we as Europe are part of a balance that is an essential condition for a comfortable ASEAN. And play that card and made it easier for ASEAN. The EU should be associated with a comfort zone, not with itching powder. There is one ASEAN nightmare, to be locked up in a strategic tug of war and be obliged to choose sides. So the EU is one key actor that can contribute to keep this nightmare at distance. So we went into this conclusion slowly, in a 3-year process. It has been a formidable experience, to work together and think together, and debate together in a very stimulating mindset. Hope, our conclusion could be of a practical value for the EU foreign ministers that are meeting this afternoon concerning Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. And I'd like now to invite Pietro Massina, the University of Naples Lorientali, to take the screen.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, thank you. Yes, I would like to return to the question of networking that Michael Montesano touched upon before, because in reality, our network has been much larger than the 13 partner institutions that were supposed that were part of officially of our network. Just to make an example, in the case of Italy, there were 5 universities that have been involved in a way or another in the activities of the project. Really what we did was to build the field of Southeast Asian studies in Europe, in Southeast Asia, to create new forms of cooperation. Is it true that it's true that we were already, when many of us were already connected and parts of this network were already in place before, but we dramatically expanded the network. The cooperation has been very important for I think for all of us. And one thing that was that we did that is important is to bring all of us to work in a multidisciplinary approach in the direction of a dialogue with policymaking. And I think this was new for many of us, not for me particularly, but I think for many of us this was a very new dimension. And we did it collaboratively. And I think this is something that will continue in the future. I think this was a specific contribution that CRISEA gave to us. And we brought discussions within the EuroCIS conference, the European Association of Southeast Asian Studies. We really created new ways to work together across disciplines, across countries. And really from an Italian perspective, I would say this was very important for us. And I think this is opening new path for the future. For my appreciation, this was a very successful project. And I stop here and I give the floor to Tomas Kaminski, which for me was a new friend, and I'm sure we will continue to cooperate.
Thank you, Pietro. Welcome from Poland. Our consortium is a very nice mix of well-established research institutions and emerging universities, such as my university or some Asian partners. And it was a kind of a challenge for us to collaborate with leading scholars from all around the world, but also an opportunity. An opportunity not only in the sense of getting funds for research, fieldworks, attending conference, workshop, etc., but also an opportunity for capacity building. And at least we can talk about a capacity building at least in 4 dimensions. The first is an improvement of academic standards. Thanks to engagement in a high quality research, we simply learned a lot from our colleagues from other institutions. Secondly, development of research management skills, taking part in steering committee, observing management team, how they try to balance between giving liberty and flexibility to researchers, and on one hand, on the other, to control the whole process, engaging so many people from so many different institutions. So it was a very good lesson how to do it. The third thing is opening minds for a more interdisciplinary research, and we are, by the way, forced to collaborate with other researchers from other disciplines by the composition of work packages. And the fourth thing, the CRISEA give us an opportunity to establish a network of partners for future cooperation. And I would like to end with sharing my personal experience. I'm a political scientist, and 4 years ago, it was hard to imagine for me to publish in a human geography journal. And now I'm going to submit contribute to such a journal because of the collaboration with other colleagues from my working package. Secondly, thanks to CRISEA, we established contact with University of Hamburg, and we already submitted as a political scientist from Łódź, together with anthropologists from Hamburg, we already submitted a grant proposal about food security in Southeast Asia, and it would not be possible without CRISEA. So my bottom line is that impact of such project as CRISEA goes much beyond publications, workshops, conferences, etc. In sense of capacity building, the long-term impact of this project might be even more visible. Thank you very much, and I hand over to Andrew Hardy.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to all the work package leaders who've just spoken to us, and thank you for your comments. For our closing keynote speech now, I am honored to introduce the chair of CRISEA's Academic Advisory Board, Amitav Acharya, distinguished professor at the American University's School of International Service and UNESCO chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance. He will share his thoughts on the subject of alternate futures for Southeast Asian regionalism. Thank you for joining us this morning, Professor Acharya, and over to you now.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. It's a bit early, but I'm fine. I will share my screen if you could allow me to do that. I do have a couple of slides that would help to shorten my presentation. So let me see if I can do it. Seems like, okay. Okay, seems working. Just give me a second. All right. So in the very limited time I have, I'd like to thank CRISEA for the honor of having me as your chair of your academic advisory board. I'm sorry I didn't get to see any of you in person because of the pandemic, and also because of my own engagements. But it is really a pleasure to know, to see how the project has come together and produced some very interesting work. I have glanced through some of your papers, but I'll look forward to reading in more detail some of them because they're very relevant to my research. As you know, I am a Southeast Asian scholar, a scholar of Southeast Asian politics and security. So I'm going to talk about ASEAN's futures, or the alternative futures of ASEAN and Southeast Asian regionalism, based on a new book that is about to come out in well, hopefully in a month's time. It's slightly delayed. But this book is a kind of update on the third edition of my book, Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia. The last 2014 edition was of course, 6 years ago or 7 years ago, and a lot of things have changed. But some things have not changed. There is a surprising amount of continuity, which we should not miss, because we tend to kind of privilege change over continuity. But in regions like Southeast Asia, or any region for that matter, continuity is also important to remember the areas of continuity. And this is basically the new book. You probably, since this is an EU-funded project, they might be very interested, because these are ASEAN leaders holding up FIFA jerseys in 2019, when times are very different and everybody was in a mood for soccer. And of course, one of the leaders is no longer a leader, at the moment at least, is Aung San Suu Kyi. So things do change, but I'll also tell you why things don't change. So I hope you'll get a chance to take a look at the book. So I'm going to talk about the idea of a security community. The framing of a lot of my work in ASEAN has been this concept of security community, although originally developed by Karl Deutsch, it has been accommodating. It has been adapted to contemporary realities, not the 1950s realities where Karl Deutsch was writing about, but the 2000s and the present. So I have a very minimalist definition of security community. People have debated this concept until, as they say, cows go home. But my idea of security community is a group of states which manages its relations among them, meaning among those states members, peacefully, despite conflicts and external pressures, through shared norms, institutions, and some degree of common identity building. So this is not a very expansive definition that makes war unthinkable, abolishes conflicts altogether. No war doesn't mean no conflict. And anybody who knows that there's always conflict among states and among people. Then it's also not a military alliance like a NATO, for example, or a collective security organization like the UN's collective security organization, one for all for one. Very important to know what a security community is and how I'm using the concept so that we don't have expansive expectations of ASEAN. That's one of the problems about Southeast Asian and ASEAN studies, that people expect too much. And it was never created for that purpose, to be an alliance, to be a collective security organization, or to abolish war or conflict altogether. So every time there is a bilateral conflict, some people think, oh, there goes ASEAN, like between Singapore and Malaysia, or Thailand and Cambodia. Those things always exist in a security community, even in the West, even among European Union members, which is a very mature security community, or between US and Canada. Okay, so there are three forces that will shape ASEAN's future, or Southeast Asia's future. I don't have time to go into it, but just wanted to tell you, one is intra-ASEAN relations, one is great power geopolitics, and one is regional institution building. Those are the three things that will shape ASEAN's future, as it has ASEAN's recent and long-term past. But I just want to make a comment about populism, because this is one of your papers and talked about. Now, a little bit of the idea of populism, the term populism is a little bit like a European Union as a model. Like a broken record, and Sophie mentioned, it comes back, and everybody rejects it, but it comes back. But populism is not very different. It's a very Eurocentric, Americanocentric term. When was Southeast Asia not populist? Now, when mature liberal democracies, including the US, develops Trump-like populism, that's news. That's big news. Or European Union member states or far-right groups in Germany or its neighbors. That's news. Southeast Asia has always been populist. And there is always a tendency towards authoritarianism, authoritarian governments. Remember Sukarno. I mean, so I just got very confused that this term has found so much prominence in analyzing ASEAN, because what we are looking at is, and maybe there is populism, but it's more organic. It's the populism of post-colonial nations, which is bound to be nationalistic, bound to have a political manipulation by elites to stay in regime, ensure regime security. Regime security has always been important to Southeast Asia. So I'm not very surprised. And I don't think we should use the European or American populism, Trump populism, for example, to Southeast Asia, because they're fundamentally different forces. That's the one thing I wanted to talk about. Moving on, I mean, I think in each of these three areas, there is good news and bad news, and that's not unsurprising. But I think I'd like to talk about one more thing about in this, especially in the great power geopolitics. Southeast Asia is not taking sides, despite all the talk that we hear, not maybe so much in Europe, but in the US. Oh, ASEAN is balancing, bandwagoning, or, ASEAN is hedging. None of these terms are correct. I think ASEAN is co-engaging because it doesn't want to take sides and never will, because that will basically lead to collapse, unless it wants to commit suicide. Or it will bandwagon with China or United States. It will not be hedging also. Hedging is a kind of a problematic term. I like waiting and seeing how things go. I don't think that will happen either. I don't think ASEAN countries are waiting and watching and not making their preferences clear. They have made their preferences very clear that they're not going to take sides, no matter what. Even at the expense of the organization's future. So that will be a violation. Taking sides will be a violation of ASEAN's norms. So it remains co-engagement. But at the same time, ASEAN centrality is weakening. What we see is that intra-regionally, ASEAN itself, I think, is steady, if not, becoming really like, there'll never be like European Union, as you all know, but it is steady intra-regionally. But when it comes to external institutions like ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asian Summit, there it's weakening. And there was always going to be the case. As I had argued, that ASEAN has taken on too much. It's one thing to manage the relations within Southeast Asia. It's another thing to aspire to be a manager of great power relations in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, whatever you would call it, because you have the biggest powers of the world interacting there. And you are a coalition of a relatively smaller and weaker states. So you can influence a little bit. To say that we are the driver or we have a centrality is always going to be problematic. And I've always argued that ASEAN centrality was a bit of a myth, and it remains so. So moving on then, what are the alternative future for ASEAN? Well, I see three possible futures, and I'll tell you which one I would go for. I think ASEAN is still a security community of sorts in a minimalist way, I argued. Will it remain so? Quite possibly for the foreseeable future. But things can change. Nobody can have a crystal ball. Nobody predicted COVID-19 to come up so strong and so fast. But the future one is the business as usual. ASEAN Way Plus, I call it. ASEAN will not remain exactly the kind of soft institution that it was. It will develop, and it is already developing, some sort of legal personality, some sort of a collective institutionalization, particularly with the ASEAN economic community, which forces ASEAN to be institutionalized. And it will probably recover from COVID-19. Asia in general is doing better than especially United States and the West when it comes to economic impact of COVID-19, and ASEAN might also do that. Future two will become a Chinese sphere of influence, like a China's Monroe Doctrine over Southeast Asia, which is a concern of a lot of American people, American scholars and policymakers in Washington, DC. But this will only happen, ironically, if China moderates its behavior. China becomes like what China was in the 2000s, not China of the 2010s. So that will require fundamental changes in Chinese strategic behavior, concessions in the South China Sea, and also a willingness to engage ASEAN on equal terms, which at the moment China is not doing. And if United States fails to re-engage under Biden, in fact, Biden has a very strong opportunity, a window of opportunity to re-engage ASEAN after the damage of the Trump years. And I think an Obama-like approach to ASEAN would go a long way in putting the US back on the map in Southeast Asia and reversing the erosion of US trust and credibility. The most recent opinion polls on Southeast Asia shows that China's trust has declined sharply. That China has a real strong trust deficit and a soft power decline, whereas the United States actually has increased. Now, one should not make too much out of this, but it means that there is a window of opportunity, or at least it says that the loss of US influence or trust in Southeast Asia under Trump is not irreversible. It can be reversed. And I have written about this in a recent article in World Today, just come out earlier this month. And finally, the third scenario would be decline and disintegration of ASEAN, which will happen if all these things come together. Intra-ASEAN tensions rise, like outright conflict between two major original ASEAN members, and at the same time, we have increasing Chinese pressure, both push and pull, meaning China attracts Southeast Asia through investments and security guarantees, and also pushes them too far away from China and get them to join a military alliance with, say, United States or Japan or others. And then what I call institutional atrophy. If ASEAN institutions keep not performing, especially the internal intra-ASEAN institution, I really don't care personally if EAS or ARF do not perform any more than they have. But I do care if ASEAN fails to maintain its institutional capacity and interactions to manage relations within, and this is very important, within Southeast Asia. So my conclusion, I think future one is probably most likely for at least the next 5 years or so. But then, people have been wrong, and I could be totally wrong. Thank you very much. I'd like to, again, congratulate you for a very successful, very active project. And my only wish is that one day I'll get to see you if you continue this endeavor and have a CRISEA 2.0 or something like that. It's very important to keep the networking after the funding ends. We all know that, people develop extraordinary networks and collaboration, and then it all falls apart when the European Union stops funding or external funders stop. So I hope you will find a way to continue your collaboration. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you for inviting me to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Ataria, for your insights and your good wishes. Your keynote now wraps up the final conference of the project. And it just remains to me to express some final thanks to all the speakers today, of course, and to the many scholars who contributed their work to this project. Also to Danila Conte in Brussels, who's helped us navigate the project's administration over the last few years, and not least the extension we were granted at the beginning of the COVID crisis. Also to CSIS Indonesia for the technical support that has made this meeting possible online. This concludes our program for today. And I was about to say that it concludes the project as well, but the networks continue to grow and to take new and different shapes. And as Terence Gomez mentioned a moment ago, CRISEA's work also continues as we write up and publish our findings, and as we upload them to the CRISEA website, where they will join the scientific report that Jacques Leider is currently writing to form the project's web archive. So thank you all. Stay safe and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Andrew.
Yves. Good to see you, Yves.